Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our virtual Corporate Social Responsibility Forum event, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, Strategic Imperatives for Sustainable Business. I'm Connie Lindsay, Executive Vice President at Northern Trust, and I run our Corporate Responsibility and Global Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion practice. I'm also co-chair of the Executives Club Corporate Social Responsibility Forum with my friend John Edelman from Edelman, who's not able to join us today. But I'm excited to welcome you for this panel discussion on DE&I strategies with guidance on goal setting, assessments, accountability, and a lot more. But before we get started, I have one housekeeping notice for our audience. Last month, the Executives Club launched a brand new podcast called The Executives Exchange, featuring CEO and founder interviews with the top leaders in Chicago. Please take a moment to take out your phone and subscribe to the Executives Exchange, wherever you get your podcasts. Megan is also dropping a link into the chat where you can learn more. And for today's event, I hope you can keep your video on during the next hour, if that helps you feel more engaged. And if you'd like a more focused view, please put your Zoom in speaker mode located at the top right-hand corner of your screen. Today, I'm pleased to introduce several of my personal friends and colleagues who we do this work together around DE&I and corporate responsibility. First, I'd like to introduce Corliss Garner from First Midwest Bank, Soon Chang Lim from Realizing Empathy, Tyrone Studemeyer from Hyatt Hotels Corporation, and Andres Tapia from Korn Ferry. I'll also be joining the panel because I couldn't resist engaging in this discussion myself. Moderating our discussion today is Trish Smith, Global Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer at Edelman. I know we are going to have a very interesting and engaged discussion, so I invite and encourage all of you to listen and join us. Trish.
Thank you so very much, Connie, and good morning. Happy Friday. I am Trish Smith, and as Connie mentioned, I serve as Edelman's Global Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer, and I am so excited to host today's conversation. Over this last year, we've all witnessed the global awakening that's taken place as it pertains to social and racial justice. An alarm has truly been sounded that will not be silenced. And as a result, so many companies are having to reimagine and evolve their DEI strategies and truly look at strategic imperatives that are necessary for sustainable business. And before we get into today's exciting conversation, I want you to hear a bit more from today's panelists about who they are and what they do, and another thought to add today, some insight that they can give you as we kick off today's conversation. And so I want to first start with Corliss. If you could share, again, who you are, what you do, and a suggestion on whether it's a podcast, book, something that those on today's webinar can learn and read to know more about this issue.
Thank you so much, Trish. Good morning, everybody. Good morning, fellow panelists. I'm Corliss Garner, a native Chicagoan. I've worked in several areas of financial services for over 30 years. Cannot believe I'm saying that. Both client-facing and corporate roles. And currently, I have the honor of leading corporate responsibility, diversity, equity, and inclusion at First Midwest Bank. Regarding a show, what I recommend binge watching is Pose. We are in Pride Month, and it is an awesome series on FX that takes us back to the late 80s, early and mid 90s during the HIV/AIDS epidemic. And the show centers on the lives of the Black and the Latino LGBTQ plus community in New York. It's only 3 short seasons, way, way too short, but it is an amazing show, and I certainly recommend everybody check it out. Get your hydration up and your Kleenex next to you, because waterworks will ensue.
Thank you so much, Corliss. Welcome. Slim.
Hello, my name is Seung Chan. People also call me Slim, and I specialize in guiding innovative founders in their development as a CEO of a venture-backed company. I've also recently launched a project to create a global support structure where middle and senior managers can receive the support they need, but cannot receive from within their organization. You can learn more about it at realizingempathy.com. As for suggestions on things to watch, if you haven't watched Soul, I highly, highly recommend it.
Thanks, Slim. And Connie, our co-convener of today's conversation, If you'd
Good
like to
morning.
share. Good morning.
Thank you. I said a little bit about myself, and I know we've got lots of good conversation to have, so I'll be quick. There's a book that I've started reading. It's called How the Word is Passed by Clint Smith. And it talks about the history of slavery in this country and how it impacts so much going on today. And so rooting myself in facts and history and data as I do this work, that's a read that I'd recommend.
Thank you. Tyrone.
Yes, Tyrone Studemeyer, and I'm really glad to be here today, Global Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for Hyatt Hotels. I would recommend Black Fatigue by Mary Frances Winters, which was birthed out of the murder and death of George Floyd, that brought this language and concepts of how Blacks were feeling in today's society. I encourage you to read that. And the other would be White Fragility, will be the two bookends. I think they're bookends that people should take a look at. Thank you.
Thank you. And rounding out our all-star panel today, Andreas.
Yeah, thanks, Trish. Good to be with everybody. I am a senior partner at Korn Ferry. I am Korn Ferry's Global Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Strategist. And what I would recommend along the lines of racial justice and injustice, James Baldwin said that we can't understand the present without understanding the past. And so his book, The Fire the Next Time, written 40, 50 years ago, is as relevant today as it was when he wrote it. And in a more contemporary way, but also looking at the past, is a terrifying series, which is hard to watch, but it is truthful. And it reveals a lot through horror and terror, is Them, the Amazon series, Them. Viewer discretion advised, but it is very truthful. And then on the topic of sustainability, The Uninhabitable Planet is a recommended read on our environmental crisis.
Thank you so much. Great content to check out, movies, books to read, and we hope that you all, if you haven't read or seen those, that you do check them out. So let's jump into today's conversation. The discussion is truly framed around the idea of DE&I as a strategic imperative for any business that wants to remain competitive and be prosperous in the future. And we know that everyone on this line today is coming to us at different stages and phases of their own DEI and CSR journey. So we'd like to start by asking a few questions of our panelists to give us thoughts on the importance of DEI to business in 2021, and if and how it fits into the CSR umbrella. So I'm going to start the conversation with you, Andreas. If you'd like to kick us off to tell us more about this connection between DEI and CSR and the importance of it as a business imperative.
Yes, we're facing existential realities on the environment, on social justice, and actually economics. And, talking with the CEOs that I work with, many of them are despairing about actually the social inequality, where they themselves say they have benefited in an inordinate amount from the social income inequality, where they feel it as a destabilizing force to society and therefore economics and therefore to their companies. So we have to look at social inequality as an existential crisis, and also the social justice issues that have come up, and the pandemic that we're still in, even though we're coming out of it slowly, have led consumers and employees to rethink their own lives. 86% in one survey say they want to see the society relook and rechange its premises about how it's working because things are not working. And 3/4 of them want to see their own personal lives change. 80% of consumers say that they want to do business with companies that take their own role in social systemic inequity seriously and are doing something about it. And 1/3 of employees are reconsidering their employment and are ready to leave their employer if they don't see their employer really taking these issues seriously. So whether you're talking about consumers or employees, or even the sustainability of our societies, the connection between sustainability, which ties to economics and the environment, and the connection to diversity and inclusion, where these leaders, and this is my last point here, are saying we cannot address these existential sustainability changes unless we're more diverse, unless we're more inclusive, and unless we're more equitable. So those linkages are front and center for the top leaders today, and that's the urgency of our conversation.
Thank you so much. And Connie, more from you about the importance of DEI to our business and how it fits within the CSR umbrella in terms of DE&I.
Thanks, Trish. So a little over 10 years ago now, I started in the role as head of CSR at Northern Trust. So we've been in this work for quite some time. And as Andres just talked about, the E, the S, and the G has risen to higher levels of prominence as organizations think about the three key ways they engage with their key stakeholders. And one of them certainly has to do with financial performance and how the risks of environmental change can impact the financial performance of a firm. I spend lots of time today talking with chief compliance officers because they want to know about investment strategies and decisions. The S is the social. That brings in the DE&I. The Edelman Trust Survey that's done every year talks about what the views are of employees relative to their positions with their companies, their expectations of us. The governance, how do we behave and conduct and comport ourselves as firms? So investors care about that. Our employees care about that. How do we put that in a strategic imperative that ties back to business strategies? So I've been doing the work and bringing in the DE&I to the CSR role. I report directly to our Chief Executive Officer, Michael Grady, gives that broad perspective. What are the governance conditions around that? And I know we're going to talk about accountability as well, but these are not two separate and distinct functions, because if we are practicing inclusive leadership and running our organizations with inclusive attributes, behaviors, and systems of reward and recognition, we will then be able to better affect the ESG, the outcomes of what it is we are called to do. And we've seen the benefits of that. It does require a different way of thinking for our leaders and a way of us to have the kind of courage to have these discussions, making sure that we are asking the questions and then questioning the answers. So the time has come. We are deep into it, but it's going to take a lot of measurement, understanding of the implications for our own businesses, and making sure that we're identifying talent and leveraging them in the right way. It's an exciting time and a time that I think it's important for us to continue to embrace.
The time surely has come. And Tyrone, would you like to share more about your perspectives on the importance of it to our business? I think you're on mute. Okay, well, there you go. I think you're off.
Great. I think it's imperative that we look at this from a business perspective and combine the two. When you look at the workforce, the workplace, the marketplace, and Connie hit on this, what our employees are saying, there's 5 generations in the workforce and how they interpret how we communicate, how we get along, how we resolve conflict, and where do we spend our dollars, and how we changing the conditions and the lives of the communities in which we actually serve and live. So I think this is a pivotal point in time for these things to come together, that we're leveraging and embedding diversity, equity, inclusion into all of the strategies so that we can get to sustainability. And this is really about also behavioral change. So how we help our leaders and how we build, begin to build and lead and coach and guide leaders today is very significant to sustainability. So we're moving from tolerance and sensitivity to crosscultural competence, giving people the abilities and the skills to navigate through cultural differences and look for ways to maximize differences and celebrate those differences, right? And honoring those differences, I think we'll get there a lot faster. And my hope is in the next generation, because they're going to challenge us as never before. They want to know why. What are we doing? What can we be doing differently? Why haven't we done this before? So I am very hopeful that we're going to be able to make a difference by combining these efforts.
Thank you so much, Tyrone. I'd love to get another question out there to level set for our audience. And Corliss and Slim, this question is for both of you, or 2 questions actually for both of you. We are a little over a year since the murder of George Floyd and the global outcry that we mentioned at the start of today's conversation. There's been a lot that's changed and a lot that's stayed the same. So would love to hear from you, Corliss, your perspectives on what actually has changed since late May of 2020 and what has remained the same.
This is such a great question of reflection. I think the pace of DE&I work has changed in the last year. The George Floyd murder provided that fire that was necessary to accelerate the pace of this work across many, many industries. And given that this horrific event took place at a time when America was grounded, like literally we were grounded. The pandemic forced all of us to slow down. We all sat down. You could not see this. And although some version of George Floyd had happened many, many times before, because of the pandemic, this was a little bit different. There was no baseball game to get to. There was no vacation to whisk away to. We had to sit with what we saw. And with that combination, I think America kind of woke up in a way that changed the pace of this work, especially in corporate America. And we know corporate America represents the microcosm of the world that we all live in. So some companies doubled down on efforts and others took their first steps to start. I think now the conversation is shifting to accountability. How are we all being held accountable for our efforts? In terms of what I think has remained the same, I think the ways that racism and discrimination change its face over time, that's kind of remained the same. When we look back at and examine our history, we can certainly see lots of progress, tremendous progress over the last 400 years. Many marginalized communities have fought really, really hard and they've won basic human rights over the last 400 years. People of color, led primarily by the plight of African Americans, people with disabilities, women, the LGBTQ community. For sure, there's been a lot of progress. But I think if we're really being honest with ourselves, even throughout the years of progress, we've seen resistance to maintain the status quo that typically benefits the majority. And with that resistance, racism and discrimination will change its face. So as a quick example, the Civil War marked the end of slavery. Black people were freed, and so begins the Reconstruction era where Blacks are gaining political and economic power. And then we see Black codes, the beginning of the Jim Crow era. That's a changing face, right? This period of time lasts for close to 100 years, and it ends with what we know as the modern day civil rights movement. But now we see segregated neighborhoods and schools that are not funded properly because funding is linked to property values. And there's been a history of disinvestment in these neighborhoods, which leads to low property values, which leads to poor education outcomes. A changing face. When women gain equal access to the workplace, we now see pay disparities. A changing face. And there are so many other examples, but it's still happening today in this moment as we speak with voting rights in this country, a changing face. So my hope is that we get better as a society at recognizing these changing faces, and we all can galvanize our resources to ensure that we continue to accelerate progress.
Thank you, Corliss. And I agree. I think this last year, the timing was a perfect storm, if you will, or incredible storm moment, which sort of galvanized what we saw. And it definitely has created this changing face, as you mentioned. In addition to that, Slim, I know that there are other challenges. And what do you believe are some of the greatest challenges and opportunities in helping to drive greater DE&I and change on a global scale?
And before I answer, I want to be very clear that I'm not an expert on DEI per se. My life's work is on empathy. So I ask everyone's forgiveness in advance for sharing a limited answer within my domain of expertise. So I host a podcast called The Journey of Realizing Empathy, which is a show where leaders, mostly founder CEOs, honestly disclose how difficult it has been for them to empathize with certain people. And can you guess with whom my guests have the most difficulty empathizing, Trish?
I can.
So their parents.
Huh.
Yeah.
Huh.
And just see, I mean, all the panelists are nodding their heads. And when I ask around my own circle of friends, this sentiment tends to resonate quite profoundly. I mean, I have a mother who's 70 years old. She still has trouble empathizing with her deceased mother to this day, right? So starting with myself, I struggled to empathize with my father until I was in my mid-30s. I'm now in my mid-40s, so it's only been a decade since I've reconciled that relationship. I loved him, I cared about him, I had a lot of compassion for him, but it was still a struggle for me to empathize with him. And the same tends to happen with a lot of people that I know. So what this means to me is that when it comes to empathy, it is often hard enough to empathize with our own family members, let alone strangers. So based on this observation, if empathy is a critical component of DEI, then I believe one of the greatest challenges we're faced in driving greater DEI on a global scale is coming clean as human beings enough to admit, honestly, that empathizing can be difficult at times. That while suboptimal, it is natural and normal for human beings to struggle with empathy from time to time. And I say this as a challenge because we currently live in a society where we are shaming people for lacking empathy.
Yep.
And shame is one of the strongest drivers away from empathy. Which brings me to what I believe is one of the greatest opportunities we're now faced in driving greater DEI on a global scale, which is using this historical time as an opportunity to evolve our society into one where we can be more emotionally honest with one another instead of blaming or judging each other, or instead of feeling like we have to conform to an emotionless image of a professional or a polite person or what have you out of fear that otherwise will be ostracized, outcast, and deemed not good enough, which once again fuels shame, which is one of the primary drivers of people away from empathy. Because I cannot tell you how many times the CEOs I coach shared with me the fear and shame they feel on a regular basis, only to say how they could never admit to such emotions in front of their employees, because if they do, they'll immediately be deemed incompetent as a leader. And yet, time and time again, what I find is that being emotionally honest with one another is one of the greatest catalysts to moving ourselves from not empathizing to empathizing with one another. And it's not just the CEOs. In the project I'm working on now with middle and senior level managers, I find that everyone struggles with emotional honesty, regardless of any superficial differences like gender, sex, age, rank, race, etc. When I ask them to be emotionally honest, instead of being emotionally honest, they share with me judgments about themselves or other people. So people have great difficulty being emotionally honest, not because they're dumb, but because emotional honesty is a skill that most, including myself, never learned. And unfortunately, judgment is another powerful block to empathy. So just to summarize, I believe one of the greatest challenges we're faced in driving greater DEI on a global scale is honestly admitting that empathizing can be difficult. And one of the greatest opportunities that we're faced in driving greater DEI is using this historical time as an opportunity to evolve our society into one where we can be more emotionally honest with one another instead of blaming or judging, or instead of feeling pressure to conform to an emotionless image of a professional, a polite person, or what have you.
You know, Trish, if I could just piggyback on that, our research on inclusive leadership have also surfaced data about the lack of empathy and the difficulty of it. We have found that one of the antidotes or one of the ways to become more emotionally honest is to actually be more curious about the people that we don't understand and don't know and are a little bit afraid to connect with. And the curiosity is an antidote that once we break through that fear of asking about other people and their realities, which there's a lot holding us back. We feel it's politically incorrect or it's rude or inappropriate. But once there's permission, and the permission is by consent, is it okay, Trish, if I ask you about what your experience has been this last year? You know, and it's an invitation. If you say no, boundary respected. But 90% of the time, people will say, thanks for asking. I've been waiting for someone to ask me, let me tell you. And as we discover the unexpected, and it's always unexpected realities about people, because we demonstrated curiosity, suddenly it starts to open up the ability to be empathetic, because now I know what to be empathetic about. So I just wanted to add that to Slim's excellent disposition there.
And if I may add on that, I think it's a formula that we use at Hyatt as a purpose-driven organization. Our purpose is to care for people to be their best. So when you talk about empathy plus care equals actions. And one thing we learned out of the pandemic is that our greatest asset was not technology, it was relationships. The more we can build relationships and foster relationships and build, Andrea said, it's getting to know you, to be curious enough, right, to assume positive intent, to be okay. It's okay not to have the answers. Listening is one of the major skills we should deploy right now. There's just listening and hearing people. You may not have an answer. You may not have, but to show people that you're listening and you're caring about who they are and how they're feeling goes a long way. So we've got to get back some of the basic things that our parents taught us, right? To show respect towards one another, to stop. Oftentimes we get so caught up in our day and we say, good morning, how are you? And no one waits for the answer. We just keep moving, right? Oh, I was just announced I had terminal cancer. Oh, good, have a nice day. We don't even hear what people are actually saying. And this pandemic and COVID-19 and the murder of George Floyd has brought us to a point in time that we have to seize the opportunity to care for one another, to put forth efforts to really sit down and listen to one another and to take action on the things. And this is now diversity, equity, and inclusion. Moving from equality to equity is key. Meeting people where they are, as Corliss talked about from a financial perspective and home ownership and school and education, a systematic racism. It's embedded in our systems. It's going to take a systems approach to do all these issues. So again, relationships are key. And I think empathy is the driver.
Trish, and if I could just put a bow on the box here, I think what Slim brought us to, and it's so important for us as leaders and individuals to understand that it is tying head, hands, and heart, which is what I say. But it's also when I'm working with our executives, honoring who they are, the places from which they come. It's more than a speech. It's more than inveigling people. It comes back to, and we'll talk about this later on, how do we help people get to that place? What are the real ways that we can say, here is a way, as Andres talked about, what are the behavioral changes? Usually it's tied to the culture of an organization. So we can certainly put things in the chat, but I'm really about, we've recognized, we acknowledge it. Now, how do we get to fixing it? And the how to anything is honesty, openness, and willingness. So I just wanted to add that as a way for us to think about it.
Oh, I think that's absolutely right. And clearly we've hit something here. Thank you so much, Slim. And I think oftentimes we get paralyzed because we're afraid of doing the wrong thing or saying the right thing. And it's not about perfection, but it's really about the connection with people and us embracing each other as human beings. So thank you so much for that. Would like to encourage persons on the line to post any questions in the chat. We will get to questions in a few minutes from you, so please feel free to post those in the chat. And as we continue the conversation, we've talked about some of the challenges and the need for empathy being one. We also want to talk about some of the motivation around this work. And when it comes to DE&I, we know that everyone comes to it at a different place and point in their own personal journey. For some, it's deeply personal, whether it's because they have their own individual diverse identity, or they're an ally to a specific community, and others are motivated by the goals set by their organization or their team. And so I want to talk with you now, the panelists, about why are both important, the individual motivation and the organizational motivation, and what are some of the factors that actually drive people to achieve these individual and company goals. And so I want to pose this to Andres and to Slim to hear your thoughts about, again, it may go back to some of the things we're talking about in terms of empathy, but would love to hear your thoughts on this question.
Yeah, as a strategist who works with leaders on culture transformation, within a leadership team and within the people and the managers of the organization, there are various motivation levers to pull on. And the best strategies are ones that really go after more than one motivator. So, many of us here have personal motivations deeply rooted in values, whether it's about people or spirituality or social justice. And that's wonderful and powerful, but that's not going to be everybody's motivator. And so others are motivated by, transformational change or invention or thought leadership or, economic prosperity in business. And so ultimately, while I have my personal motivators that are important to me and the people that I'm closest to, I am more interested in the outcomes. So whatever your motivator is that gets you to the same outcome that we all want, even though we might be there for different reasons, I'm all for it. So ideally in an organization, they will have both social good and deep sense of values motivation to accompany their economic interests. And that combination is actually, I think, the most powerful, because there's times when the economic interests will seem unattainable, but you still got to do the right thing. So if you only have one motivator, it may make the work less sustainable. So sustainability is really held up by this combination of the personal or the deeply valued, as well as the extrinsic motivations of economic prosperity. But if I can get at least one of those, rather than zero, I'll take one of those. So that's how I see it sort of strategically.
Thank you so much. Slim?
Yeah, I mean, I think I can only speak to my own personal motivation and some of the clients that I have. Like for me personally, I have a drive to do the work that I do on empathy because I've also felt personally like I don't matter or that I don't belong, both from my experience with my father, but also having been physically bullied in my teen years. But I've also learned that there's great value in coming to empathize with people I struggle to empathize, because it is through exactly such experience that I learn perspectives that I would have never otherwise been able to have. It completely covers my blind spot that would have been impossible to otherwise cover. So for example, coming to empathize with the bullies I had in my teen years helped me recover from that time, because I learned that my being bullied had nothing to do with me. The bullies were themselves feeling like they don't matter, that they don't belong, and they were just acting out on that impulse because they didn't know how to actually process that emotions themselves, or to be emotionally honest with me, or they felt like if they were being emotionally honest that they would themselves matter less or belong less, which just creates a whole vicious cycle. But at the same time, I want to take this opportunity to say, I think it's also worth adding on to these drives, the importance of support. Because even if I have those two drives, I don't think I would have been able to empathize with my father or those bullies. I had a lot of support, ton of support, community of support. Without that, I don't think I really stood a chance in that journey. Because in my mind, I go back to some of the anthropological research I've read. In ancient tribes, there's always these rituals where people may be put outside of their own tribe because they have to grow and develop into an adult, but they're always supported, because when they come back from these rituals, they're welcomed, celebrated, reintegrated into their tribes. And this whole entire feeling of like, even though I'm in a very difficult and gruesome place, I have people who have my back and they will support me no matter what. Having that sense of security, I think, is super, super important, because I know many CEOs I coach have the drive. It's not like they don't have the drive, but they don't feel supported in that process. So they eventually burn out. They get really bitter. They get really resentful of like, I'm doing so much, and how ungrateful they are to like not appreciate this. Not that they should always be appreciated for the things they do, but as a human being, I think it's very natural for us, if we merely have the drive, that it could eventually lead us to burnout. So the support is very important.
You know, to bring that back into the workplace, I think what leaders have to challenge today to do is build what we call psychological safety, providing the infrastructure and the space for people to feel comfortable with speaking up and speaking out. Leaders have to be more vulnerable today than they've ever been before. And we talk about this from a statistics perspective. We talk about, you know, studies just showed recently that only 15% of white working Americans have one Black person in their network. So that would suggest that 70% of white leaders don't have anyone Black in their network. 70% of jobs are filled with internal referrals. So if you don't have anyone in your network that's Black or of color, right? And when whites say we can't find Blacks, they can't, because they're not in networks. We have to figure out how we build those relationships and give people the skills and the ability to go outside of their comfort zone, to meet with others and to be able to recommend them so we can change the dynamics of the workforce and the workplace. The demographics are shifting. We got 4 years and the minority will be the majority. And with that, it's people are fearful, they are afraid. So we talk about what's happening in the workplace. The leaders is one part of it, but the bigger part of it is how we're going to prepare the workforce to be able to navigate through these differences and provide a safe place for psychological safety, for people to feel comfortable enough to speak up and speak out, to make recommendations, to bring solutions forward. We have got to figure this out as a team. You can't do this collectively. We talk about empathy, walking in someone's shoes. Some people don't want to bend over to put the shoes on. Let's face it. We got some people that have fearful of what this is going to do for them, right, going forward. So let's shift on what do we do to change behaviors. Because that's the only way you're going to drive change is you're moving from tolerance to sensitivity to cross-cultural competence, from attitudes to behaviors, skills that leaders can build on to change the environment in which we all live and work. And that's all I'm going to say about that. Sorry, Connie.
No
You
need
know,
to.
I love you, Tyrone, and this is what we do. I think what our participants are seeing is certainly the passion we have for the work, but the kind of personal courage it takes to do the work. And it is not about us fixing people. That's number one. We can't fix anybody, right, Slim? It is not this notion of fixing. And I often say to people with whom I'm working or coaching is, when I become uncomfortable with the conversation, and all of us in this work know, in order to do it, we've become comfortable with being uncomfortable, but I respond with wonder. And so I'm saying to myself, if something is making me uncomfortable or I'm thinking of responding in a certain way, judgmentally or otherwise, I wonder why that person has that perspective or view. I wonder what their motivation is. So, that's a tidbit that I'd offer. And, I love you, Tyrone. And so we just do what we do.
Absolutely. No need to apologize at all. That's what we're here to do today. And psychological safety is so critically important. It has such major business repercussions. In fact, in one report I think I read, it said that when people feel uncomfortable talking about things within an organization, things that aren't working in particular, the organization isn't equipped to then prevent the failure or to succeed. And so want to move then into talking about how do we succeed? How do we work to set up goals and create systems that help us remain accountable and to be transparent in our DEI journey towards reaching these goals? So Connie and Corliss, would love to hear from you. If you could provide an example of meaningful strategic DEI goals that you've set and created within your organization, and what was involved in that process in terms of determining the measures of assessment and metrics for success. Connie or Corliss, one of you can take it away.
I'll go ahead and jump in. I think what's really most important about goals and goal setting is ensuring that they're relevant for where you are as a company in your DE&I journey. A company that's just starting this journey will have very different goals than a company that's more mature in this work. I joined First Midwest back in August of 2019. I can't believe I'm saying that, just about 2 years ago. And I joined to build an integrated CSR and DE&I strategy to really develop that solid foundation for the work ahead. We had to take some time to just be honest about the organization that we are and dig down and do a diagnostic. And that diagnostic, we're still actually in the midst of it, will help us get very, very prescriptive about our talent strategies and our roadmap to building diverse representation and the associated goals and metrics that are aligned to that. And Andres is smiling a little bit because we've been joined at the hip for the last several months on this diagnostic. But in the meantime, while we're doing this kind of honest assessment of who we are as an organization, I knew that there was an opportunity for us. There was an opportunity for us to learn more about these topics across our entire organization. We needed to elevate the dialogue about diversity, equity, and inclusion, elevate concepts about diversity, equity, and inclusion. So that involved engaging our colleagues as well as engaging our senior leaders to build that acumen and to elevate that dialogue across the company. And we've done just that. We've had a series of learning experiences for not only our colleagues, but our executive leaders. And with that, the way that we think about measuring that inclusion in the workplace is how is inclusion being viewed in our workplace. One key metric there is our engagement survey, our colleague engagement survey. And over a short period of time, we've seen an increase in our inclusivity metric in our engagement survey because we have been elevating that dialogue. So I think the key here is honest assessment of where you are as an organization, build goals based upon where you are in the journey, and then what gets measured gets done. Attach some metrics to it.
So Trish, I'd add, Northern Trust has been doing this work for 30 years. And as with any kind of strategy, we have to adapt. We have to be agile. We have to make sure that we're scanning the periphery for changes. We look at the changing demographic. But about 3 years ago, we refreshed our DE&I strategy. And I'll invoke Andres' name again because we engaged Korn Ferry to help us with this work. We did a big search to determine what firms could really adequately meet our needs. And we did it in two ways, quantitatively and qualitatively. We've had a lot of qualitative discussion this morning, and that happens because we're human and we need to do that. But the quantitative piece, we're a financial services company, and so we do look at data and have numbers. So quantitatively and qualitatively, we had hypotheses about what was causing the differences in representation within the firm. We did surveys and conversations with our partners around the globe. We're a global company. So diversity, equity, and inclusion for us has to be culturally specific. While in the US, we may talk about gender and race and ethnicity. In other parts of the world, it is different. So we wanted that cultural specificity. And I'll give you one example of the work that we did together. And through it all, Andres and I have remained friends because it was quite a journey, because the three outcomes for us were accountability, expanding training and development, and culture. And many of you have heard, and I'll paraphrase it, that, culture eats strategy for lunch or breakfast or whatever meal you choose. And so when you're talking about that, how could we concomitantly engage all of those aspects, look at the hypotheses that we drew, and determine which ones we could move levers on to have impact on the organization? One of the things that came out for us in a big way is we looked at, the hypothesis was that movement had a correlation to advancement within the corporation. And so we said, let us look at that based on data. We looked at 4,000 moves in our firm over 4 years. Who was getting the moves? What were the implications of that? And based on what that told us, we knew that there was an opportunity then for us to change the systems and structures that were causing the lack of representation that we saw across groups. We also created a scorecard for our managers, so they know exactly what the representation is, what it looks like, then moving to goals. All of this, I'm really speed walking you through it, but there are levels of detail and data. Getting the buy-in from those senior leaders, addressing the concerns that they might have, the difficult conversations from our white male colleagues saying, what about me? If you're looking to promote and advance Blacks, Hispanics, and women, or people with disabilities, what about me? Those are not easy answers, but those are the kinds of things that we have to courageously face. Talking to our clients and our key stakeholders about it, because not every client is in with what it is we might be trying to do. We have a diverse client base. So having to do all of that, our products and services, tying it back to CSR, how does climate change affect our investment strategies and decisions? Asking those questions, and how do we then think about portfolios and products and services? So a big way. So we're about into year 3 of doing the work. We are seeing progress. And most encouraging for me is the way that we have seen the ideas and the thoughts of some of our senior leaders change. The accountability is critical, because if you know you're going to be held accountable for it, just as we are for financial performance of the corporation, people are then more motivated to get things done. And as Andres talked about, whatever your motivations are, we know that we have to tap into that and just to keep that going. And there is a lot more work that we're doing, pulse surveys, those kinds of things. And we've met with my team, and I have a global team, and we've met with almost half of our employee population. We have about 20,000 employees. So we're probably up to about 8,000, where we're doing these small groups. We call it holding space with our partners and having these kinds of conversations, what we learn about one another. So it's been a rigorous process, leveraging our business resource councils as we talk specifically about various groups. And I'm happy to, after be able to engage with any of you, if you're talking about specific strategies and ways that you get that done, would be happy to do that, because we're doing this in a very concise fashion, but there are specific tips, tools, and techniques that I'd be happy to share because of the passion and the belief that I have in that. Until all of us are willing to do the kinds of things necessary, we won't make the progress as quickly as we need to.
And if I could circle something that Connie said, in that work, when Connie talks about movement, she's talking about lateral movement. And the discovery was that lateral movements, so these are not promotions, these were not pay increases, but they were developmental experiences, or short-term assignments or expat assignments or just a special project, but there was a correlation between these lateral movements and promotion. And then when an equity analysis was done, certain groups were favored on those lateral movements versus others, and it was a hidden, disparity there that was now predictive of promotion and therefore predictive of representation. So the accountabilities became crystal clear. Sure, you want more diversity at representation and promotion, but they were not going to get there unless they got equity on the lateral movements. And that's where a lot of energy happened. And by the way, lateral movement, recession proof, COVID proof, job freeze proof. There's a lot of things that managers can do to accelerate lateral movements. And in the case of Northern Trust, it would, because of the developmental mindset that Northern Trust has and the value it puts on these lateral movements, it was a fabulous place to go, rich. And that's part of the reasons why there's now, forward progress on representation and on promotions.
This conversation is so rich. I feel like we need 2 more hours to get through the number of questions that are coming up in the chat. And I do want to turn to those very quickly so we can get some of them in. And Connie, you just mentioned business resource groups, affinity groups, whatever you call them within your organization. And this question goes out to anyone on the panel who would like to elaborate, but could you talk about the importance of these groups to your overall DEI strategy, and what are some of the ways that organizations have effectively leveraged them? So based upon your experience within your organization or what you're seeing as best practices.
We have 11 business resource councils, as we call them at Northern Trust, and we've seen it work in several ways. One is for specific areas of our business, the understanding that those groups have with that particular affinity, whether it's women, African Americans, Latinx, what are LGBTQ, disability. So it's helped us to get a better understanding of the needs from people with lived experiences. It also then allows our employees, whom we call partners, to engage in different ways. And one of the things that our group has been doing, our BRCs that have been doing over the past couple of years, and specifically in response to the pandemic, is doing work together. So we each have our own group where we have our lived experiences, but when I, as a member of a different group, can engage with another partner from another one of the BRCs, it really makes the experience so much richer. And how then we are able to really develop that empathy and understanding versus the separation, but bringing it together. And we have a governance structure around that. We actually have a council that has representation from each of the groups, and they then help to drive strategy. And so they engage in that way. And during the pandemic, allowing our partners to be able to talk to one another, whether it was having different virtual events. So that's been really important, and providing that direct feedback to leadership as well.
If I can build on Connie's comment, and similar to her, we have the difference here is that our executive committee members are executive sponsors of our DBRGs, opposite of the groups, to build awareness. So you have two white men working with Hyatt Black to help understand Black culture. You have two heterosexual white women over our Pride group, right? So we do it deliberately intentional to build what we call the cross-cultural competence and the ability to advocate for other groups that they're not like. Our DBRGs are designed and created by the minority for the majority to have an experience otherwise they would not have. So creating that environment that you're helping to understand not the difference, but the cultural differences. We're more similar than we are different, but our cultures is what makes a difference the best. So if we can create those psychological safe places for leaders to learn and to advocate for others, we can then remove barriers to stop people from moving up. We also use from a business perspective, our Hyatt Black leadership team has got together, looked at what services and products do we need to have in our hotels as we try to go after the $1.9 billion that Blacks are spending in travel. So we're looking at, do we need to have shea butter, larger shower caps? 80% of our reservations are made by women. So when women comes into the room, do they have the shower curtain open or closed? Because if it's closed, someone could be behind it. So having it open, having maybe women deliver room service. If a woman is single, traveling by herself, may not want a man to come at 10 o'clock to bring her coffee or a tea or what have you. So having women to do it. So looking at your DBRGs to have to leverage to grow the business, it is a critical part, but your leaders play a role in this as well. So having them to understand and advocate for other cultures, and equally to Connie, our DBRGs have to work together, communicate together, do business collectively. So that strategy, we're maybe segregated, but we're also inclusive. So every year we have, in celebrating Martin Luther King, we have a program, we bring our DBRGs together to talk about inclusion for us all. And there we develop our strategy of what we're going to do, linked in with the business strategy, but tactics that we're going to do to help the business to be able to grow and to prosper. Sorry,
and Trish, if I could just add to, just piggybacking off of Tyrone about the business strategy, a best practice is our ERGs are representing us in the community. So they really build our brand in the community, particularly diverse communities, and they can help with things such as recruiting and community engagement. So there's lots of ways that BRGs, ERGs connect into leveraging the business and moving the business forward.
I think, Trish, there's a question about compensation of DBRGs. That is something that LinkedIn and Twitter are doing now. That is something that people should look at, because you're getting skills and talent, developing skills and talents, and they're utilizing to grow the business. You need to reward them in some way, right? Whether it's paid time off, giving contribution to their charity of choice, something to be able to reward them for the work they're doing on the side of their desk. That's the new evolution of DBRGs.
And I've led a BRG before in my former life. It is another full-time job. So that is a growing conversation for sure.
So the question about how we help people get there, I guess, in achieving our DEI goals, given the demographic population shifts as the majority is becoming the minority. And this is the question posed. I will pause and say that we've actually advised clients not even to use the word minority, and that it is a misnomer in many instances. It has negative connotations, and it is in fact not a fact in many parts of the world. So even changing the language, so we use emerging majority in our conversations. But the question is, any thoughts about how we lead with changing face and leadership as emerging majorities are becoming the new majority? So I guess it's, how do we help people get there in terms of this transformation? Connie, you mentioned it when you talked about people saying, if we're saying increasing Black and brown faces, what does that mean for me? How do we help bring everyone along in this journey? And that's open to any panelists that would like to share.
So Andreas will remember this, and Kelly Salix is on the phone as well, is that back in we all worked together at Hewitt years ago. And what we built was a program using the individual development inventory to assess what people are on the continuum between denial and adaptation. And once you assess where they are, then what's next? So we created what we call a cross-cultural learning partner program, where you partner individuals together who are different based upon race, gender, orientation, even function, and where they landed on the IDI. And then provide them with a lesson that they actually review together and discuss together in one-on-ones. And you're building relationships, you're building confidence, you're having courageous conversations. If I am in acceptance and Andreas is in adaptation, and we have a conversation about vulnerability in the workplace, he may see things that I don't see from a strategic or thought leader that I may have not considered, and vice versa. So we can put people together and help them to understand different perspectives and different backgrounds. I think we'll get there a lot faster. If I am not in a relationship with you, I probably would not extend the benefit of the doubt. I may not reference you. I may not speak up for you in a meeting. I may not, study shows that 80% of what's said about us is said about us when we're not in the room. So if I'm not in a relationship with you and I don't know enough about your background and your skills, when an opportunity presents itself, I may never bring Connie forward. But because I know who Connie is in a relationship, I can recommend her. When we can get our white counterparts to be able to build relationships, honest, true relationships, and provide feedback and listen, I think we'll get there a lot faster and remove the fear. This is all rooted in fear. Because what about me? What about how I feel? Where do I fit in this equation? We've got to create mutual adaptation, that we come at this together and that we learn together, we celebrate and not reprimand. Because nobody wants to be reprimanded or put down, because it's going to shut them down. It's going to close them out.
Hey, Trish, can I add one thing to this? I want us to take a macro view of this also, because while it might be true that the color of what's happening in society is moving more towards people of color, the systems and structures, the things that really control resources and access are not changing at the same rate and in the same way. So I think concomitantly, we must have ways that we are impacting systems and structures. What are we looking at, the ways that gaps and lack of access to resources are happening? How are investments of capital being made? So I agree, we need to make these one-on-one relationships and behavioral changes, but we also have to have a more macro view of the flow of capital. What are we looking at in specific areas in parts of certainly the country, but of the world, because it is the way the flow of capital moves, where resources are. If we look at environmental racism or environmental injustice, most of the areas of the world where that is happening, there's people who don't have access. So I want us to also consider that as we think about the work we're talking about, the hands-on day-to-day, but for those of us who are also looking at what are the structures, because massive numbers of brown people who are still not having what they need to have good health or access to healthy food, the implications of the numbers are not telling the true story.
I knew we'd run out of time. I said that at the start earlier on, and I want to go through a quick speed round to each panelist as we prepare to wrap up this very quick hour that we've had together. If you could provide us each with a concept, a mantra, a story that drives your continued work in this space, because we know it is work. If you could share that with our guests today so that they can keep that with them. It's something you may say to yourself or you may share with others or your team. And if we could just start, Corliss, if you want to begin.
Absolutely. I think about the quote, scripture, to whom much is given, much is expected, much is required. And I think about the folks who have paved the way for me, a young girl from the west side of Chicago, to be in this position to affect change. I really take that seriously. I take that responsibility very personally, and that's what drives me every day to continue to do this work.
Slim.
So I personally envision a world where each and every one of us, from the moment we're born until the day we die, feels certain there's at least one person that we can reach out to at any given moment who can and will support us in the way that actually makes us feel supported. And I find it remarkable just how many professionals I meet do not feel supported inside their organization. And some of them don't even feel supported at home. And so I believe there's something in our society that's going on where many people feel alone despite the company. So I hope we as a society don't miss this opportunity to evolve our society into one where all of us can feel supported.
Thank you. Tyrone.
I would like to give a challenge. Each of us given 24 hours a day to do what we will. We could do something good or do nothing at all. You've been empowered, you've been inspired, you've been encouraged, and you learned from this session today. I encourage you in your next 24 hours to do something good for somebody that you don't know anything about, to pay it forward, to provide empathy, care, and take action. And we will close the gap.
Andres.
Yeah, you know, the motivators are deep, but there's a current one for me, and it's in a disturbing statistic that in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder, 58% of Americans said, yes, what happened to him was murder. But a year later, when the same question was asked of white Americans, the number had dropped to 26%, by half. A year later, after something that we all saw in broad daylight, filmed for 9 minutes, 20 seconds, after all that, there's less people who, from the majority culture, who see it as murder. That is disturbing and a call to action that we have a lot of work to do for all the progress. And I'm not denying there wasn't progress this past year in the racial consciousness around racial injustice, but it's not sustained yet. It slips, you know, it's elastic. It's wanting to revert back to the mean. There is backlash. And so the need to be vigilant is there every single moment.
Thank you so much. And Connie, over to you for your final response and our closing remarks for today.
Thank you, Trish. I'd say for me, it's speak less, do more. Oftentimes we know that words have power and words formed together have impact and energy. But what can I do that will have sustainable impact, as Andres said, because I too still remain disturbed at what we've seen and heard and the actions and the counter forces that would seek to undo what it is we're trying to do. So I encourage all of us to get that level of courage and conviction and commitment to say less, but certainly that the words we have would land on fertile soil so that we can grow some different behaviors, but also do more. And I look forward to being on that journey with each of you as we continue to do more.
Wonderful. Connie, did you have any final remarks for us today?
Sure.
As we close out?
I just want to thank you, Trish. Thank you so much for your masterful moderation of this panel. You handled a group of us who talk a lot and really have passion for it brilliantly. So thank you so much for doing that. And I again want to thank my wonderful colleagues and friends just for what you do every day to show up with the kind of professionalism and courage and compassion that you bring and the empathy and curiosity that you have for what you can do to make this world better for all of us. I'm grateful to continue to be in your presence. So I hope all of you found this session helpful and that you'll carry something with you the rest of the week. And I would ask that if you could continue to look for more upcoming virtual programs for the Executives Club via our website. In particular, we hope you can join us on June 16th for the Business Technology Forum's annual Women in Technology panel, and you can sign up online. Thank you again for joining us. Have a great rest of the day. Stay well, everybody.